strip and work our way from the top down. We got our clearance lights. You want to make sure the clearance lights are amber in color, free of moisture, not cracked, damaged, and make sure they're working properly. Check the windshield, make sure the windshield is not cracked, damaged, and make sure there's no illegal stickers. Come down to the lights. I would check my right turn signal, my left turn signal, my four-way flashers on both, my high beams and my low beams on both, and make sure they're all working properly with no cracks and free of moisture. Then check under the truck, make sure there's no leaks, and make sure the truck is not leaning. Cap is on tight, make sure it's filled to the proper level, and make sure the reservoir is properly mounted secure, not cracked, not damaged, not leaking. Your washer fluid hoses, you want to make sure there are no cuts, no frays, no leaks, and properly attached. Then you got your coolant reservoir. You want to make sure the coolant reservoir cap is on tight, make sure it's filled to the proper level, and make sure the reservoir is properly mounted secure, not cracked, not damaged, not leaking. These are your coolant hoses. You want to make sure your coolant hoses are properly attached, and make sure there's no cuts, frays, or leaks. Right here we have our alternator. You want to make sure the alternator is properly mounted secure, it's not cracked or damaged, and make sure all bolts are present. And you want to mention the fact that it's belt driven. Belt driven. Then we have our alternator belt right here. Should have no more than 3/4 of an inch of play, and it should not be cut or frayed. Down here we have our water pump. You want to make sure the water pump is properly mounted secure, all bolts are present, it's not leaking, and you want to mention the fact that it's belt driven. Belt driven. Then we have our lower radiator hose connected to the bottom part of the water pump. The lower radiator hose. You want to make sure the lower radiator hose is properly attached with no cuts, no frays, no leaks. When we get over to the other side, we're going to start with our upper radiator hose. Upper radiator hose should be properly attached with no cuts, no frays, no leaks. Then we got our oil cap, oil fill cap. You want to make sure it's on tight with no leaks around the cap. And you also want to make sure the oil is filled to the proper level. Do not take the dipstick out, but explain the process. Tell her that you would take it out, clean it, stick it back in, pull it back out, and make sure that it's above the fill mark. Next, we have our air lines. You want to make sure all your air lines going from the engine compartment to the cab are properly mounted and secure, not cut, frayed, or leaking. Then we have our air compressor. Air compressor should be properly mounted secure. All bolts are present, not cracked, damaged, or leaking. And you want to mention the fact that it's gear driven. Gear driven. Next, we have our steering components. We're going to start right here with our power steering reservoir. You want to make sure the power steering reservoir cap is on tight. Make sure it's filled to the proper level. This is a dipstick, so again, explain the process. Tell her that you would take it out, clean it, stick it back in, pull it back out, and make sure that it's above the fill mark. Then you got your power steering hoses. You want to make sure your power steering hoses are properly attached with no cuts, no frays, no leaks. Right here we have our upper steering linkage. Upper steering linkage should have no more than 1 inch of play either way, or 2 inches in total. Drop down here, we have our power steering gearbox. Power steering gearbox should be properly mounted secure, not cracked or damaged. Make sure all bolts are present, and you want to make sure it's not leaking. Right here we have our pitman arm. You want to make sure the pitman arm is properly mounted secure, not bent, broken, or damaged, and make sure your castle nut and cotter pin is in place right here, securely mounted. Then right here we have our lower steering linkage. Lower steering linkage should be properly mounted secure, not bent, broken, or damaged, and make sure it's secured with a castle nut and cotter pin on this end right here. Next, we're going to drop down to our axle. We have 3 sections that complete an axle. 3 sections. We're going to start with suspension, brakes, and tires. Suspension, we got our spring mount. You want to make sure the spring mount is properly mounted secure to the frame, not cracked or damaged, and make sure all bolts are present. Your leaf springs, you want to make sure your leaf springs are not cracked, shifted, or broken, and make sure they're properly mounted and secure. Next, we have our U-bolts. You want to make sure both U-bolts are properly mounted secure. They're not cracked, damaged, or broken, and make sure there's no missing bolts on the ends. Next, we have our shock. You want to make sure the shock is properly mounted secure and not leaking. Next, we have our brake system. We're going to start with our brake hose. You want to make sure the brake hose is properly attached with no cuts, no frays, no leaks. Connected to it is your brake chamber. The brake chamber should be properly mounted secure, not cracked or damaged, not leaking. All bolts are present. And then we have our push rod and our slack adjuster. Push rod and slack adjuster. You want to make sure it's properly connected with the pin in place, and there should be no more than 1 inch of slack when pulling on it by hand with the brakes released. And then on the inside of the wheel for brakes, we have our brake lining, which shouldn't be less than 1/4 inch thick, and our brake drum should be free of any oil and grease, not cracked. Moving on out to the tire. On the tire, we check 3 subjects. The abbreviation that we use is ICD, inflation, condition, and depth. The inflation of the tire is 110 psi. Just mention the fact that you would check it with an air gauge on the valve stem. The condition of the tire should be evenly worn, no cracks or any bulges on the side. And then the depth should be a minimum of 4/32 on the steer tires. Next, we have our rim. You want to make sure the rim is not cracked, damaged, and make sure there's no illegal welds. Your lug nuts. You want to make sure all lug nuts are present. There's no shiny threads or trails of rust to indicate looseness. And then we have our hub oil seal, which should be properly mounted secure, not leaking, and make sure all bolts are present. Our way down the side of the truck, we have our turn signals, left and right, 4-way flashers, and marker light. You want to make sure it's amber in color, free of moisture, not cracked, and make sure it's working properly. Check our mirror, make sure our mirror is properly mounted secure, all bolts are present, make sure it's not cracked or damaged. Your door, you want to make sure it opens. Mention the fact that you got good weather seal on the inside, properly intact, and the door also closes. Next, we have our steps. You want to make sure your steps are properly mounted secure and free of debris. Underneath the truck, we got our exhaust. You want to make sure the exhaust is properly mounted secure. It's not cracked or damaged, not leaking, and make sure it's pointed down. Right here we have our drive shaft. You want to make sure the drive shaft is properly mounted secure, not bent, broken, or damaged, and make sure all bolts are present on both ends. And then the last item in the middle here, we got our frame. You want to make sure the frame itself is properly mounted secure, it's not cracked or damaged, and make sure there's no illegal welds. Then we got the frame of the truck, the bed of the truck. These are called cross members. You want to make sure all your cross members are present. They're not bent, broken, or damaged. Then we're going to move to the axle. You have 3 sections that complete an axle: suspension, brakes, and tires. So we got our spring mount. You want to make sure the spring mount is properly mounted secure to the frame. It's not cracked or damaged, and make sure all bolts are present. Then we got our leaf springs. You want to make sure the leaf springs are not cracked, shifted, or broken, and make sure they're properly mounted and secure. Then one of you guys can slide in the front here, and one of you guys can come around the back. Next, we have our U-bolts. You want to make sure your U-bolts are properly mounted secure. They're not bent, broken, or damaged, and make sure all bolts are present. And then we have our shock. Our shock back here should be properly mounted secure, not leaking, and make sure all bolts are present. Then we have 2 added parts on this suspension. There are 2 parts on this suspension that aren't on the front. You have your airbags and your torque arm. Our airbags should be properly inflated, not leaking, and your airbag mount should be properly mounted secure to the frame, not cracked or damaged, and make sure all bolts are present. And then if you guys come under here, we have our torque arm, which is a bar going from one side of the frame to the other. Underneath here, do you know where it's at? Okay. Sorry guys. Torque arm, you want to make sure this torque arm right here is properly mounted secure, not bent, broken, or damaged, and make sure all bolts are present. Okay, so on this axle right here, you have your suspension. Suspension parts are your spring mount, your leaf springs, your U-bolts, your shock, and then you have your airbags and your torque arm. Next, we have our brake system. So come around here. Same parts we had on the front axle. We have our brake hoses. You want to make sure your brake hoses are properly mounted and secure, properly attached with no cuts, no frays, no leaks. Then we have our brake chamber. You want to make sure the brake chamber is properly mounted secure, not bent, broken, or damaged. Make sure it's not leaking. Back behind the brake chamber, you have what's called a push rod and slack adjuster. Push rod and slack adjuster. You want to make sure it's properly connected with the pins in, and there should be no more than 1 inch of slack when pulling on it by hand with the brakes released. And then on the inside of the wheel for brakes, you have your brake lining, which shouldn't be less than 1/4 inch thick, and your brake drum should be free of any oil and grease, not cracked. Now we have our tires. You do not have to do ICD on both of these tires. When you have dual tires, you only have to do the outside one. However, you do have your bud spacing. Okay, your bud spacing should be free of debris. Make sure the tires are not touching, and you want to make sure it's evenly spaced all the way around. Then we come to our ICD on our tires: inflation, condition, and depth. The inflation of the tire should be 110 psi. just mention the fact that you would check it with an air gauge on the valve stem. The condition of the tire, you want to make sure it's evenly worn and make sure there's no cracks or any bulges to the side. And the depth should be a minimum of 2/32. Next, we have our rim. You want to make sure the rim is properly mounted secure, no illegal welds, not cracked or damaged. Make sure all your lug nuts are present. There's no shiny threads or trails of rust to indicate looseness. And on our axle seal, you want to make sure the axle seal is properly mounted secure, not leaking, and make sure all bolts are present. Before we go around the back, we have our DOT reflective tape on the side here. You want to make sure it's properly mounted secure, clean, visible, and in good condition. Then we have our marker light. You want to make sure the marker light, it's marking the back of your tractor. Marker light, you want to make sure it's red in color, not cracked, damaged, and make sure it's working properly. Come around the back. On the top, we have our DOT reflective tape on the top 2 corners. You want to make sure it's securely mounted, clean, visible, and in good condition. Come down to the back, you have DOT reflective tape again. You want to make sure it's properly mounted secure, it's clean, visible, and in good condition. And then we're going to check our lights. Mention that you would check your left turn signal, your right turn signal, your 4-way flashers on both, your tail lights on both, and your brake lights on both. And make sure they're all working properly with no cracks and free of moisture. Check under the truck, make sure you have your splash guards or mud flaps, however you want to call them, properly mounted secure, not ripped, torn, and no more than 8 inches from the ground. Okay, so you guys just jump in the truck. First stuff you're going to check is your safety equipment. You're going to tell them you got your triangles and fuses in the red box, and you got your fire extinguisher on the other side of you, which is fully charged and properly mounted and secure. Next, we're going to perform a safe start. So we're going to put our seatbelt on, make sure it's not cut, frayed, and it latches properly. Check our parking brake, make sure it's engaged, which now it is. Turn the key on and make sure the transmission is in neutral. At this time, start the engine. Okay, now that I started the engine, I'm going to work my way from the mirrors and work my way in. Start with my mirrors, make sure they're properly adjusted for me, make sure they're not cracked or damaged. Check the windshield, make sure the windshield is not cracked, damaged, broken, make sure there's no illegal stickers. Check the 2 things that involve the windshield, check the wipers and the defrost, and make sure they're both working properly. Check the city horn and the air horn, make sure they're both working properly. Next, I'm going to check my lights. Turn my lights on, check my high beam indicator, my left turn indicator, my right turn indicator, and my 4-way flashers, and make sure they're all working properly. Next, I'm going to check my gauges from left to right. I have my water temperature gauge right here, which is reading about 160 degrees, so I know that it's working properly. My oil pressure is about 20 psi, so we know that it's working properly. Our voltmeter, which is between 12 and 14, it's in the green, so I know that it's working properly. And last but not least, I have 120 pounds showing on my air pressure gauge, which is fully charged, so I know that it's working properly. Next, I'm going to tell her that I'm going to start my air brake test. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kill the engine and release the parking brake. So kill it and release your parking brake. Once it stabilizes, I'm going to tell her that I should not lose more than 2 psi in 1 minute. I'm going to start it. Okay, we're going to go ahead and call that a minute. So now I'm going to tell her that I'm going to apply pressure to the brake, and I should not lose more than 3 psi in a minute. So I'm going to apply pressure. And you got to kind of hold it still so you don't let any air pressure out. Okay, we'll go ahead and call that a minute, and I'm going to tell her that I'm going to pump off the air pressure, and around 60 psi, your warning light and buzzer should come on. So the light's going to come on underneath this one, and the beeping is going to beep a little bit faster than what it's beeping right now. So I'm going to pump it down around 60 psi, that should happen. Okay, there's my warning light and my beeping change sounds. Now I'm going to continue to pump pressure down, and between 40 and 20 psi, my parking brake should engage. Okay. Okay, now that my parking brake popped out, I know that that's working properly. I'm going to do another safe start, check my parking brake, make sure it's engaged, transmission's in neutral, and I'm going to start my engine to build the pressure back up to 120. Once the pressure gets above 60 and your alarm goes off, your low air pressure light goes off, you then can tell her that you're going to jump out and grab your chocks. cut. Okay, so now that you jumped out of the truck, you grab your chocks, you jump back inside the truck. Don't forget to put your seatbelt back on. Don't forget that. Okay, and you're gonna tell the instructor that you're gonna do a tug test. Okay, so what you're gonna do, you're fully charged at 120. You're gonna tug against your parking brake to make sure that it's working properly. So I'm gonna make sure it's out. I'm gonna put it in drive, and I'm gonna give it a little tug with the gas. So I know that my parking brake is applied, and I know that it's working properly. Now I'm gonna release it and check my service brake, okay? Hold on. Check my service brake. Step on the brake and tell her that my service brake is working properly and my steering wheel should not pull to the left or to the right. At that time, I'm gonna put it in neutral, set your parking brake, and tell her you're now finished with your pre-trip inspection.